What the heck is going on in South Africa? The African National Congress Party just lost its parliamentary majority in a historic election result this past Saturday that put South Africa on a brand new political path, something that they have for the first time since the end of the apartheid system of white minority rule that had ended 30 years ago. My friends, this is big. For anyone who remembers, 6, 7, 8 months ago when I had done a video on specifically the economic and political collapse that seemed to be happening in South Africa, elements of that have just gotten worse as time has gone on, and we specifically talked about the corruption within the ANC and how over time this is something that has weakened and eroded their support among the populace. Well, now we see the results of precisely that. The once dominant ANC had received just over 40% of the vote in the election, which in a multi-party system is something that for most would be great, but this is well short of the majority that it had held since the famed all-race vote of 1994 that had ended apartheid and brought it to power in the first place under Nelson Mandela. And so despite winning the election with the most votes, the ANC do not have a majority of over 50%, and thus, for the first time in their history, they have to make a coalition if they want to stay in power. While opposition parties have hailed the result as a monumentous breakthrough for a country that for years has been struggling with deep poverty and inequality, the ANC still by far remains the biggest party by some way. However, as I just said, in order for them to really do anything within the government, they are likely going to need a coalition partner, or, in some cases, partners. The chances of the current South African president, Cyril Ramaphosa, of having a second and final term are up in the air. And this, my friends, is massive. Now, my friends, I have not made a follow-up video on South Africa since I had spoken about its economic collapse this past year. However, with recent events and what has occurred, it's very important that we go and turn back to this very troubled nation. Monumentous changes are about to occur. But the question that many people likely have is, well, what has actually happened in the past year? What is going on that has led to this situation in the first place? Of course, I am not going to be going into the full story of the collapse of South Africa. If you want to hear that story, then please go back and check out my previous video, which I will definitely leave a link for down in the description. But for those who are uninitiated about the entire thing, I will provide a very quick recap, especially quick by my standards here. As many of you are probably already aware, South Africa is a state grappling with its past as a former colony with a large minority white population that for centuries have been the elite of society. Going back 100-odd years in 1910, the Union of South Africa was created out of the Cape, Natal, Transvaal, and Free State territories or colonies, and at this point, South Africa, or the Union of South Africa, was essentially a white dominated union. Black native opposition to this was, of course, inevitable, and out of this opposition arose the African National Congress, or the ANC. The political party that we just spoke about here was founded back in 1912 in order to protest the exclusion of black people from power, and they would use both non-violent means in the beginning, and then after this transition into more violent methods. In addition to them, in 1921, the South African Communist Party was established at a time of heightened militancy, and more discriminatory legislation was then enacted in order to try and control the country. Meanwhile, white Afrikaner nationalism, fueled by job losses arising from a worldwide recession, that is something that would only increase during this time period. And that kind of mentality would effectively set the norm for the next 60 years within South Africa, at least until reform would take place going into the 1990s. As the domestic situation within South Africa became more and more tenuous, as the scale of protests and oppositions would increase during this time period, the government would embark on a series of limited reforms in the early 1980s. As time would go on, mass resistance would increasingly challenge the apartheid state, which in turn would resort to intensified repression, accompanied by eventual recognition that apartheid was just not something that could actually be sustained in a modern state. It was at this point that many white Afrikaner elites started to openly declare that they were in favor of a more inclusive society, with a number of business people, students, and academic leaders meeting publicly and privately with the ANC in exile. Petty apartheid laws and symbols were openly challenged, and eventually these were taken out, and so together with a weakening economy, increasing internal dissent, and also international pressure, these varying different developments would eventually lead to the fall of apartheid. Yes, we have skipped over a lot of history leading up to this point, but again, if you want more on that, you need to go back and check out my previous video. It's at this point point that South Africa would hold its first democratic elections that were open to all peoples in April of 1994, this being under an interim constitution. It was here that the ANC would first emerge as victorious with a 62% majority of the vote. After this would happen, South Africa was divided into 9 new provinces that were meant to replace the 4 existing provinces and 10 black homelands. In terms of the interim constitution, the NP and Inkatha Freedom Party would go and participate in a government of national unity under President Mandela, who was South Africa's, as I said, first democratically elected president. The second democratic election that would occur in 1999 would again see the ANC increasing its majority to the point that they would end up having a 2/3 majority of the entire total vote. We're talking like 66%. Moving on from that, 5 years later, that gap would get even bigger. In the April 2004 election, the ANC would win the national vote with 69.68% of the vote, and the celebration of 10 years of freedom was attended by heads of state and government delegations from all across the world. This was a point, 10 years after apartheid, the strongest political movement that you could possibly have in the country, besides if it was just simply a one-party state, though for all intents and purposes it basically was. This was the high point of the party. This was the most control that the ANC was ever going to have. After that, though, is when things would begin to slip, as the party that was supposed to be about freedom and redemption instead became known more as a party of corruption and nepotism. From the 1990s onward, South Africa's new majority black government would attempt to try to redress historical racial injustices by increasing the diversity profile in both government and private sector jobs. In 1996, as an example, the GEAR, or Growth, Employment, and Redistribution Plan, was enacted, and this would in turn be followed by the BEE, the Black Economic Empowerment Act. This wasn't enough, though, and in 2003, the BEE was then supercharged to become the BBBEE, which, yeah, I know, it's the acronyms, it's how this whole thing works, but it's Broad-Based Black Economic Empowerment, which is something that would move beyond mere race and would also embed gender and social equality objectives into its policy aims. Despite the somewhat confusing names, they are very on the nose, they're very obvious. These were initiatives that were specifically spearheaded by the ANC, and as long as they could show their base that they were doing something to try and tackle racial inequality, everything was fine. Because before 1994, economic opportunities were essentially denied to African people. There wasn't anything that they could do within the bureaucracy, there wasn't anything that they could do within high-paying tech or factory positions. Pretty much, if you were African at this time within South Africa, you had to work lower-class menial jobs while being managed by what was essentially your white overlords. My wife is looking at me funny when I'm saying this. Yes, I will put a picture of you, or my editor will put up a picture of this so everyone understands who hasn't seen me before why this is especially weird that she walks in on me doing this. But yes, the policy was specifically set out to redress this historical imbalance in all spheres of the economy and society. And this initiative, my friends, was pretty wide-ranging. It did a lot of things. It included things like employment equity, skills development, preferential procurement. It would also help with enterprise development and increase the number of representatives that you would have of specific races, in this case African, in managerial positions. Everything about this policy was specifically meant to address issues that affected the mostly black population of South Africa: unemployment, economic stagnation, and poverty. It wasn't just about things for the elites. Which I say that, but then the very unfortunate flip side to the Black Economic Empowerment policy was, well, it was really corrupt. Over time, the requirements of these programs to specifically support black Africans were co-opted and abused by aspects of the government. What would happen is that the government of South Africa would have a contract for work that would need to be done within the state. Whether this was something like purchasing a certain number of goods, building something like a road or some kind of other development project, or literally anything else that had to be done, there would be a contract for it, and the normal course of action of what would happen is that a government would try and get the best deal that they possibly could, whether that is the cheapest price, the highest quality, or a mix between the two. But what would end up happening with these contracts is that they were oftentimes improperly awarded at very inflated prices to individuals that were politically connected. This was done, as I said, at both a higher price than what they should have been paying, and simultaneously, usually at a significantly lower quality. Oftentimes when we're talking about this issue, it would tie into another form of corruption, something called state capture. And this, my friends, when we're talking about things with contracts, this was the perfect kind of environment for it. And let me explain. State capture, for those who are not aware, this is a type of systemic political corruption in which private interests significantly influence a state's decision-making process to try and get some kind of advantage out of it. Like basically, one of the simplest examples that I could give, and I know I talked about this in my previous video, is that imagine that you have something like a road that is estimated to cost $1 million to build. One company offers to do that for $2.1 million, and then they go and bribe the politician that is actually choosing who gets to build the road with $100,000. That means that in order for them to build it, the money that they would need has doubled. Like the government is paying $2 million instead of the estimated $1 million that they were supposed to pay, but the government official that chose it, hey, they made $100,000 out of the deal. As you can imagine, you go and repeat that scenario a bunch of times and you have a significant amount of government waste. This form of corruption would become exceptionally common under one of the South African presidents, Jacob Zuma, something that even to this very day he denies. And also, I feel like I should mention over the course of talking about this in this video, that individual is, weirdly enough, the head of a splinter party from the ANC now. I know I'm going to butcher the pronunciation from it, Mekonto Sewezi, or MK. We're going to call it MK for the rest of this video. But yeah, he gets kicked out of the party for corruption and ends up coming back in the most recent election, leading a brand new party. Another form of corruption that you would see here in South Africa was BEE fronting, which, if you want to explain that in any kind of simple terms, it's basically tokenism. It's an abuse of the rules governing BEE, where qualifying persons, as in people of the right race, would be given a seat on like the board of directors for a company, but they don't ever actually have any powers to do anything within the company. They're only given that role specifically so that the board can go before the government and say, hey, look, these are the races of the people who lead our company, therefore give us contracts. And they would get them in the name of BEE. And mind you, when we were talking about all of this and dealing with the ANC, everything that we've mentioned here is more of the private sector, though it is affiliated with the government. Related to all of this within the actual government itself is cadre deployment and employment, which, mind you, this is a form of corruption that is an official policy of the ANC. What do I mean? Well, basically what it means is that if there is some kind of vacancy within the government to do some job, the director of some kind of department, or the manager of some other kind of field, whatever kind of the position is, these positions were going to be filled with ANC loyalists. Basically, it did not actually matter what your qualifications or actual abilities were. It really only mattered to the government that you had the right skin tone, and also you were loyal to the party. Among all the possible things that we could talk about when dealing with corruption, this is easily perhaps one of the most common and pervasive issues within the ANC and South Africa as a whole. Mostly because in comparison to other types of corruption that one can talk about, this one was technically legal. And that is what makes it particularly so insidious. A lot of the information I'm about to list comes from the Zondo Commission report, which is a report that was done on corruption within the presidency of Jacob Zuma, and it gets really bad. Essentially, the ANC, the African National Congress, this one party, would control both the demand side and the supply side of senior administrative roles, this being within state-owned enterprises, within boards of different companies, directorates, and other things, entities, and any kind of independent state institutions. Every government-affiliated position that you could imagine, they had a hand in controlling who went in, when, where, and why. What I say when I talk about the ANC even controlling the supply side is that what they did is they built up a database of loyal ANC cadres who are ready to take up high-paying positions within the government whenever it is that they became available. These cadres would apply to the ANC's Cadre Deployment Committee, and when they would do this application, their abridged CVs would be uploaded to a so-called database list. These would be assigned a database list number, and they would then be ready to deploy on any decision of the committee. As we're going to explain here in a second, the value and where they are in that list will depend upon a series of factors, with their experience and actual skill not being one of them. You will see what I mean. At the same time that they do this, the ANC would similarly manipulate the demand side of appointments. No government department, no state-owned enterprise, no anything would be able to advertise its vacancies before the ANC's Cadre Deployment Committee could decide who from the ANC should be favored for those roles. The cadre records that would come out during this time are quite literally littered with very specific commands to the ministers in the cabinet and to the president himself that no adverts may go out until the ANC had chosen their preferred cadre for the job. And here's what I mean. The way that the database would work is that when a vacancy would arise, the committee would get to go and pick a name from the list. And then that person, whatever, their ranking on that list is, they would then get delivered into a very high-paying government role. In ranking the database, like determining where it is that you were in it, the ANC's Cadre Deployment Committee would consider loyalty to the ANC above all else. Again, it did not matter what your skill was, it didn't matter what your background was, didn't matter any of that. It was the ANC loyalty above all else. In fact, even within the ranking system, there was a system that would gauge someone's loyalty that would determine how soon a cadre could actually be deployed to a high-paying government role. With the highest tier in this list that you could be ranked as is a true cadre of the movement, a person who was both a ANC member and also a long-standing activist. Naturally, of course, this is not going to apply to everyone. And so when a position is to be filled and there are no true cadres of the movement that are available for a role, the next one up for deployment would be just an ordinary ANC member. If no actual ANC members are available who are like actual members of the party, the committee would then look at ANC supporters or sympathizers, people who are more likely and willing to work with the ANC. And then finally, at the end of all this, regardless of the need for skills, experience, excellence, ability, any of it, only fourth after every single thing has been considered, their political affiliation, their loyalty, their race, literally anything. Last on the list to be considered for a job was a person who was a, quote, non-ANC member. The ranking system that we're talking about here is something that is based entirely on loyalty to the party, and it would ensure for decades that ANC people were always preferred above skilled but non-political applicants. It was a system that was meant to ensure the best position for every member of the ANC, not the best person for that actual position. Yes, my friends, if that sounds like a recipe for disaster, then you are absolutely right. As would be found out in the Zondo Commission for Inquiry, cadre deployment was likely a primary driver of state capture and the subsequent collapse of many state-owned enterprises, because you had people getting into positions that did not actually know how to do their job or care for it, they were just loyal. Between the period of 2018 and 2020, the ANC's Cadre Deployment Committee would directly intervene around 12 times in the appointment of state-owned enterprise boards and also their CEOs. You just say that your sim is a bit... My wife is literally mocking me as I'm trying to make this. She made a sim of me and apparently it's a better YouTuber. He's also pregnant. Gabby, what have you done to my sim? Anyway, one of the companies that the committee would interfere with was the Transnet board appointments back in 2018. Transnet, for those of you who are not aware, is the largest and most crucial part of the freight logistics chain that delivers goods to each and every South African. Transnet performance would largely progressively deteriorate since 2018, ranging from port congestion and a collapse in freight rail infrastructure. In November of 2023, the Transnet board would indicate that they had submitted a 100 billion rand bailout for the entity because it just could not seem to manage itself. Another interference that the committee would, commit was with Denel, a major aeronautics and military equipment developer of South Africa, and their board appointments back in 2018 also. According to a presentation that was made by Denel executives in Parliament in 2023, the entity was essentially insolvent from 2019 to 2022. Because again, those who were appointed did not know what they were doing. And honestly, my friends, when we talk about this, there are so many more cases that even down to the most vital entities, such as the electricity producer of South Africa, Eskom, and the largest water management company in Africa, Randwater, all of these things were affected. For anyone who went and saw my previous video, over the course of 2023 and going into 2024, South Africa would grapple with a severe energy crisis, something that was marked by frequent and extended blackouts that, when this would happen, could last up to 10 hours a day or even longer. President Cyril Ramaphosa and the ANC would continuously face mounting pressure during this time to try and address this crisis that, to be honest, had been building for literally decades, and then nothing was being done about it, which would in turn have far-reaching implications for the country's economy, social welfare, and overall development. Bad implications. As an example, in 2022, the country would witness more than 200 days of power cuts, which, at that point, that was already considered the worst year for blackouts in the entire history of South Africa, and that would only get worse going into 2023. Furthermore, Eskom has been plagued by allegations of corruption and state capture, which have severely affected its actual ability to deliver consistent and trustworthy electricity. The utility has accumulated massive amounts of debt, estimated to be around 450 billion rand, or 31 billion US dollars. And this is something that has limited its capacity to actually invest in its own infrastructure, upgrades, as well as modernization to be able to produce more electricity in the first place. The debt burden has only further strained Eskom's operations, exacerbated the energy crisis, and also undermined the utility's ability to provide consistent and reliable power to South Africans. They just can't really do anything. When you look at everything else that we've already talked about, state capture allegations would also raise concerns about political interference within Eskom, with contracts allegedly being awarded to people that were politically connected, as well as their entities. What this has done is compromise transparency and diverted resources away from essential infrastructure investments. More money was wasted on things that didn't need to be paid for. The consequences of this mismanagement and corruption would extend far beyond the energy sector, though, impacting the entire economy, with all of its businesses and essential services like healthcare and education, as they need electricity in order to be able to run. Prolonged blackouts have disrupted productivity, deterred foreign investment, and affected public safety all across the board. And my friends, for those of you who have been watching and are wondering why am I going into so much detail about this, you have to understand this has been so bad. And I know that I'm going and skipping ahead when I say this, that to not do anything about this specific issue, would effectively be political suicide, which means it was incredibly relevant to the current election, because in the run-up to the election this last week, the ANC essentially had Eskom paying insane sums of money to run additional gas turbines to try and plug the gaps in electricity production, so that hopefully in the 2 months leading up to the election, they would have less pissed off voters who didn't have any power. Yes, that's right. The company had to go and pay for very expensive diesel in order to run these turbines. And if you're wondering just how much money we are talking about here, it is really bad. As load shedding would intensify over the course of the year, so too would the amount that had to be dipped into from the state coffers, with diesel expenditure for each financial year being, in 2021, 5.75 billion rand, in 2022, 8.6 billion rand, jumping up to 21.25 billion in 2023, and then right now, in 2024, what has been spent is 23.38 billion rand, which is around 1.3 billion US dollars. I need you all to note this when I'm talking about this. This is the 2024 number that is a draft and unaudited. We are literally in June at the time that I'm making this, and this election would occur at the end of May. We are halfway through the year, and they have already spent more money in those couple months than they had in the entirety of the previous year. You can only imagine as to how bad this is going to be. While the government would deny that anything of the sort was being done, even the utility's former CEO, Andre de Ruyter, who exposed endemic corruption when he was at the helm of Eskom itself, but then ultimately had to quit his job in early 2023 after he was poisoned with a cyanide-laced coffee, he would go on to say that the only plausible explanation of why they're suddenly able to produce more electricity is that diesel is being burned at, quote, the rate of knots. In a television interview this last year, de Ruyter would say that Eskom would lose more than $55 million every single month to theft. This being in part thanks to organized cartels that would operate freely within the utility, and also dodgy procurement where things would be paid way too much for. Like, as an example of just one of the things that I could give is that there is a record of an audit where it was found that the company paid $11,000 for a single mop. My wife just said that is reasonable. Gabby, unless this is a jewel-encrusted mop, I see no reason as to why this thing cost $11,000. So yes, things within Eskom were bad, and I know in my previous video that I had talked about the electricity crisis that South Africa has been facing for the past several years. But at the time that I did that, I had neglected to go into more detail about the water crisis that the country is also facing, as South Africa is currently in the grips of a severe water crisis, and this is something that can be traced back to its dysfunctional water boards. As an example, since 2018, the ANC's Cadre Deployment Committee would interfere with the appointment of the Rand Water CEO position in 2019. Poor management of water reticulation infrastructure by Rand Water would then cause massive water shortages in Gauteng, this province, we're going to put it up here, that would go on to leave some residences without water for over a month. I'm going to butcher these other names as well, but the Cadre Deployment Committee would also interfere with the appointments of water boards at Nomadi, Bloemfontein, Transcaledon, Overberg, Magaliesberg Water, and many, many more. This is something that over the course of the past several years has been a persistent issue with the ANC, which in turn would not be so bad if it wasn't for the fact that at the same time that this is happening, anyone that could possibly be overseeing any of the varying different aspects of the government, like the Director Generals, yeah, these were people that were also being appointed by the ANC. Individuals who, as I said, remember, were appointed specifically for their loyalty, not for any actual ability. Over the course of 2022, wasteful expenditures to the value of 40 billion rand was incurred by ANC national departments that were under the control of these Director Generals. Some of the ones that we could possibly list here were the Women, Youth, and Persons with Disabilities Director General, the National School of Governance Director General, the Justice and Constitutional Development Director General, the Military Veterans and Department of Defense, the Communications and Digital Communications, the Environmental Affairs, Forestry, and Fisheries, and also Home Affairs. And honestly, when I talk about this, there is so much more that we could go and say. It is insane just how much of the government for years has been effectively controlled by party yes men. And that, my friends, is something that people can see. It has been seen and pretty obvious for years, which in turn has steadily helped to erode the support base that for years would prop up the ANC. And that, my friends, brings us to the election this last week. South Africa's governing African National Congress is now faced with a very tricky dilemma, which will determine the future of the country after it spectacularly lost its parliamentary majority in this previous election. Having won only 40% of the vote, the ANC needs to find a coalition partner in order to secure a majority in parliament, which will in turn support its choice of president and legislative plans, unless it, of course, decides to go with a minority government and then have to make deals with other parties in order to get anything passed. And this, my friends, is where things get really interesting. One option that they would have is to strike a deal with the second biggest party, the Center-Right Democratic Alliance, or DA, which won 22% of the vote. However, even though by getting them in an alliance that would secure their majority, this would be very politically risky, as the DA's critics accuse it of trying to protect the economic privileges of the country's white minority that were built up during the racist system of apartheid. A charge that the party denies, to be sure, but it is still something that is seen as the party of white people within South Africa. Alternatively, the ANC could go and work with two radical parties that broke away from it: former President Jacob Zuma's MK party or Julius Malema's Economic Freedom Fighters, EFF. What we need to note about this and why this is such a tricky situation is that these three parties share the same kind of constituency, the black majority, and their combined vote comes to around 65%. Mr. Malema has warned the ANC against forming a coalition that would, quote, reinforce white supremacy, that they cannot work with the DA as they would then be a puppet of the white imperialist agenda. One of the big obstacles to this deal, though, is the DA's fierce opposition to the ANC's efforts to create a kind of welfare state, especially a government-funded national health service, which is something that the DA absolutely rejects, saying that it is too expensive and threatens the future of the private health sector. The DA is something that believes in the free market, it opposes minimum wage, and it wants to reduce red tape, saying that this is the best way to actually improve the economy and raise living standards for all South Africans. In addition to this, the party is extremely opposed to the ANC's black economic empowerment policies, seeing them as discriminating against racial minorities, while simply leading to the enrichment of ANC's business cronies, which, if we've covered that here over the course of this and other videos, yeah, it's true. But denying these allegations, the ANC has over the years resolutely pursued these policies, arguing that they give black people within the state a stake in the economy that they were excluded from during apartheid. Members within the government, such as the ANC chairman, Gwende Mantaneshi, would go as far as to say that the ANC's black empowerment policies are non-negotiable, that they will not get rid of it. This, in turn, means that it is possible that a coalition with the DA is not possible at all. The other option that the ANC has is to form a coalition with MK, which was one of the big winners of the election by securing the third spot with 15% of the vote in the first election that it ever actually contested in. This is the party that I was talking about here that Jacob Zuma is leading. The problem, though, with this party is that it is demanding a fresh poll, alleging that it actually got more votes and that the final result was rigged, that the ANC didn't even get 40% in the first place. The Electoral Commission Commission has of course rejected these allegations, and MK has not actually presented any evidence that this happened, like they don't have anything. But even if ideologically these two parties should be somewhat similar, the chasm between it and the ANC is way wider than between other parties. Partly because between the leaders of their respective parties, there is a particular personal animosity, Mr. Zuma and Mr. Ramaphosa. After all, Mr. Ramaphosa, the current president of South Africa, is the guy who ousted Zuma as, the previous president. So, in addition to demanding a new president, MK also wants the constitution to be torn up so that South Africa could become, quote, a unfettered parliamentary democracy, something that the ANC has completely ruled out. Due to these limitations of not wanting to completely destroy the Constitution, that is also something that perhaps limits the ability for the ANC to work with the EFF, as they have been demanding a constitutional amendment that would allow them to seize white-owned land and expropriate it without compensation. To explain that, Mr. Malema, the guy who's in charge of that party, was actually a former ANC youth leader who was expelled by the party in 2012 for fomenting divisions amongst the party and bringing the party into disrepute. This guy would go on to say that the EFF was willing to work with the ANC, but the party's demand for land expropriation was a cardinal principle, and it would not join the government if the ANC rejects it. But okay, I'm throwing around a lot of terms here. What exactly does all this mean? What are the numbers looking like? Well, the ANC and the EFF together have 198 seats, this being something that is just short of the 201 seats that are needed for a parliamentary majority. So this means that even besides those two, a smaller party would also have to be brought into the coalition. Or what they could do is they could team up with Mr. Zuma's MK, a party that also does support land expropriation and says that there is a need to distribute farmland on a, quote, equal basis among the farming population. The issue becomes is that in order to change the Constitution, in order to make it so that this can happen, a 2/3 majority is needed. And again, the ANC, EFF, and MK just fall short of the 267 seats that are needed. Between all three parties, even if they all work together, they only have 256 seats. If this does actually end up happening, though, the DA party strongly opposes it, any kind of deal that could occur between its three rivals, saying that if this happened, it would be a doomsday coalition, something that would turn South Africa into a Zimbabwe or Venezuela. Which actually, now that I'm looking at it, now that that's mentioned, I should probably do a video on Zimbabwe and that disaster, since I've already talked about Venezuela before and the issues that they face. If land starts getting seized from farmers and being given to party loyalists who don't have the technical skill or experience, then yeah, South Africa could also add on a food crisis into this giant mess of a mix. Anyway, what was said about that whole idea of this coalition was that, quote, the Doomsday Coalition would plunge the country into ethnic and racial conflict, the likes of which it has never witnessed before. This being a quote that would come from the DA party, which I can only assume means that they're talking about since apartheid ended, considering the racial conflict of before. But still, while some ANC officials do not want to include MK or EFF or other parties and just roll things along with a minority government, there are ANC officials who hold the opposite view, that stability would be threatened if MK is excluded, given its electoral successes, which have made it the largest party in some states, like KwaZulu-Natal. KwaZulu-Natal is South Africa's second most populous province, and is oftentimes described as the economic artery of the nation because of its ports. It is also politically one of the most volatile provinces, with a history of violence, as more than 300 people ended up dying in riots after Mr. Zuma was sent to prison back in 2021 on corruption charges. Or rather, no, he was convicted of contempt of court for defying an order to cooperate with an official inquiry into corruption during his 9-year presidency, which had ended back in 2018. Yeah, that whole thing is a mess. ANC members in KwaZulu-Natal point out that with another court case looming, Mr. Zuma is due to stand trial next year on charges of corruption over a 1999 arms deal, which, if that goes through, there is a very real risk of a fresh wave of violence. Therefore, there are a number of members within the ANC who feel that some sort of deal has to be reached with him in order to draw a line under the past, and to recognize his status as a former president, especially as he has demonstrated that he is able to still get 15% of the national vote behind him, something that has severely split the party. On the other hand, ANC leaders in Gauteng, which is South Africa's biggest and richest province, they are said to favor a deal with the EFF. But their hand has been considerably weakened by the fact that the two parties parties, if they do decide to work together, will not have enough seats for a parliamentary majority. All of this means, from everything that we have talked about, that there is an increasing prospect of a ANC-DA coalition, especially as this is something that is favored by the private sector as the best option to guarantee the economic stability of the country and to avoid capital flight sucking out all the money out of the state. This is the coalition route. There is still a very real possibility, as has been reported, that the ANC is considering an option to just form a minority government and just signing confidence and supply agreements with the DA and the Inkatha Freedom Party. Through these deals with two smaller parties, the two would agree to vote with the ANC on crucial issues such as the budget, while the ANC would have to constantly lobby them or other parties to support it in other legislation, meaning, literally, they would have to be bribed, which I can only imagine is not going to help the corruption situation. For the two parties of the ANC and the DA, this may potentially be one of the best options, as it takes the ANC out of its dilemma of having to choose a coalition partner, and it also stops the DA from forming a coalition with their rival, which in turn could cause them to lose a bunch of their support base. The issue then becomes is that the formation of a minority government could lead to political instability and transactional politics. Opposition MPs could demand or be offered bribes in order to back ANC-sponsored legislation, and there's really nothing else that could be done about it. It would just have to happen. At this point, my friends, when I'm making this video, it is really too early to tell what is actually going to happen. All the parties are still considering their option, but many South Africans are hoping that by the time that Parliament ends up convening within the next 2 weeks, that there will at least be some kind of deal on what the government is going to look like. Because we are entering uncharted territory here, and though the future may be uncertain, only time will tell if it's going to be more confusing than the past. My friends, this has been Stakui with the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel. Thank you very much for watching. This has been a rather confusing update that we had to the whole South Africa situation, because rather than a whole series of events happening, we had to go into more detail about what previously set all this up, and also by explaining the background, you understand as to why things are an even more confusing mess with this election. Either way, please let me know in the comment section below what it is that we should do next, and I will see you all next time. Thank you, my friends, and goodbye.